Now is it on? Oh, great. Okay. Thank you for that introduction. I think this is about as much politics as I ever want to do with the IAS. The word president isn't a very good name anymore. It's it's sort of a little bit tainted these days. So I'm going to go through my personal view about how the management of HIV is changing, and assuming there's no cure. Obviously, if there's a cure, things would be rather different. There's some of my disclosures. So I'm going to talk about immediate start of antiretroviral therapy. And then I'm going to talk about what antiretroviral therapy we start normally, and concentrate a little bit on the latest stuff on 2 drugs. And then talk about why we should be careful about new things. There is a very famous philosopher who said, beware of any event that requires new clothes, right? So when new things come, they can sometimes have a problem. And then about the future, which might be injectables and implantables. And injectables are now being introduced in the US and they're coming to Europe. So immediate start. So this is also known as rapid start or same-day start. And although they've got these 3 names, they're not all quite the same thing. So one is, the real definition for me is that you start on the same day as your HIV diagnosis. But then people say, you could have your HIV diagnosis in the community, 3 weeks later you end up in a clinic and you start on the same day in the clinic. That is not same day start, that's a 3-week gap. So it's difficult to define, but this is what I think. So it might be really essential for people with acute HIV infection where you really want to get the viral load down as soon as possible and prevent the reservoir from seeding, and also people who are very late presenting with low CD4s, who may be unwell. Obviously, there are some exceptions like cryptococcal meningitis to get them on therapy. But what about people who are well, 400 CD4s who get diagnosed? So the recommendation for same-day initiation here is a bit different. The DHSS say, this is a bit resource intensive and we don't know about the long-term benefits. And WHO, IAS and EACS all basically say, yeah, it's sort of recommended as soon as you can after diagnosis. But will rapid start be better than what we do now? So the TIEs have looked at this in large groups, and they basically said, and this is the message here at the bottom, those in the same day antiretroviral program were nearly 4 times more likely to start antivirals, and those in the same day program were twice more likely to become virologically suppressed. So it looks like there might be some benefit in being able to convince people to start treatment and to stay on treatment, because you can't be virologically suppressed unless you stay on treatment. Now, in my setting, which is so-called high income, there's very little data. It is coming, but there's very little data actually. So when you hear people from resource-rich countries telling you, you must do same-day start, ask them where their data is, please, because there isn't very much. Look at the numbers, 101, 38, etc. There's some more data coming out of New Orleans. But basically, all we've shown is you engage patients in treatment and you get them suppressed quickly. Well, that's because you've started them on treatment. But there are some concerns. Is the patient ready to start? It's very easy to convince and coerce people into treatment, actually, to say you've got to start right away, even though they might have some reservations you should be talking about. Are you ready that any patient that comes to your clinic you diagnose, that you've got time to counsel them on that day, get the pharmacy ready on that day, get the drugs to them, all the rest of that stuff on that day? Are you ready? Is the clinic got capacity? Are the patients in the end going to be long-term adherent, and are they going to be satisfied who do this? We don't know yet. What are the long-term virological outcomes? We need to do more work. What happens if they have baseline resistance and you put them on some drug and they don't come back? If they come back, you might be able to adjust it, but say they don't come back. Have you generated more resistance? If you're going to give them a 2-drug therapy to start, which I wouldn't recommend at the moment, screening for hepatitis B, and is it actually going to be more costly? So all of these things need to be looked at. So if you do decide to start people on the same day you test them, what are you going to give them? Are you going to give them an integrase plus 1 or 2 other drugs, or are you going to give them a boosted PI? So what do the guidelines say? The guidelines, EACS, USA, say if you start on the same day, basically, give a high genetic barrier drug, which makes sense because if they've got background resistance, you don't want to generate more. So they say a boosted PI, dolutegravir or bictegravir, and the DHSS say the same, but they also tell you which nucleosides to give, which is tenofovir, emtricitabine. So there are some guidance, but look where this guidance comes from. It comes from regions of the world that have no evidence, really. Well, they're no evidence. They have little evidence about rapid start. So there we go. So it is something to be aware of. I think in the end it's going to be a good thing, but we need more research. And if you are going to do it, document it, audit it, check it, make sure that that in 1 or 2 years' time, if you've started doing this, that you can actually look at your data and say it's been successful. So what about routinely? What about routine treatment? Are we going to give integrase to everybody? Because WHO basically said integrase to everybody and efavirenz as an alternative. Will we only use integrases now in first line, or can we use them also in second line? And what's going to happen to non-nukes and boosted PIs as a first line choice? Well, all the guidelines are basically saying integrase. So the ISUSA have only got integrase. DHSS, EACS, and EU are primarily, but there are some integrases, raltegravir and elvitegravir, with barrier to resistance. There are drug interactions, and here in India, where you have a lot of TB, and you have a lot of patients taking drugs without telling you what they are. We have the same, but they go to any pharmacy and take things. There are drug interaction problems, and I am going to talk about toxicity. So what's the difference between any of the integrases? Well, basically, here's some of the data. Raltegravir versus dolutegravir, they were non-inferior, they're similar. Bictegravir versus dolutegravir, non-inferior. And in fact, the only real difference between the integrases is a genetic barrier to resistance. And raltegravir and elvitegravir, it's low, and in bictegravir and dolutegravir, it's high. So that's really the major difference. The only one other one you might think of is that raltegravir is not given as a combo pill. Okay? So that's it. And that's why I think people are moving to bictegravir and dolutegravir because of the genetic barrier. What about non-nukes? Well, efavirenz, we know it well. You can give 400 milligrams of efavirenz, and probably even in TB it's okay as an alternative with a few less side effects. But there's this new non-nuke called doravirine, and doravirine was non-inferior to efavirenz. It has potency against some of the resistant mutants, especially K103N, and it's got a very good tolerability profile. So if tomorrow you could switch efavirenz for doravirine, that will be useful. The problem is with TB, it's probably not useful in tuberculosis. Anyway, doravirine's on its way, and we now have access to doravirine. And PIs, well, I think they're going to end up having limited use in first line, probably with people with transmitted drug resistance. We try and avoid them these days because of drug interactions, and there's a lot of switches away from boosted PI, and that they're ending up being second and third line drugs. What about single pills? Everybody loves a single pill. That's what they tell me. But actually, when you talk to patients, a lot of patients aren't concerned whether it's a single pill. They're much more concerned they're taking pills only once a day. But if you look, this is what we have now available as single pills. Now, in India, it's slightly different, and you have generic pills, etc., going on. But look at the number of single pills there are. So it is quite incredible that we started off with one single pill, the one with efavirenz 10 years ago, and now we have so many of them. So people do think about generating single pills, and I would say that the generic companies as well have been very important in making these single pills available to people around the world. And if you look at there is a dolutegravir 3-TC tenofovir pill, of course, which is used by WHO, and it's probably going to be the most used single pill in the world soon. But what about the nucleosides? Do we need them? Do we need these drugs? Well, people are worried about tenofovir because of the renal and bone effects of tenofovir, and abacavir partly because of the HLA testing. It may not be available everywhere, and also cardiotoxicity. I'm not going to go into this in big detail, apart from you can see that people are trying to move away from some of these nucleosides. There is a new nucleoside, TAF, which is a form of tenofovir, alafenamide, which doesn't have the bone and renal toxicity. And the data suggests, actually, if you use old-fashioned tenofovir and with an agent that's not boosted, the toxicity is very small. So you can carry on using that in most patients. So, why should we now move to 2 drugs only? And this is the way a lot of management's going in the States and in Europe. 2 drugs, not 3. Well, I said about nucleoside toxicities as an issue, and we've now got high genetic barrier drugs that are unboosted. And if you have 2 drugs, it could be they're lower cost, not always. Fewer drugs might be a good thing. And when you talk to patients, often they say, oh, less drugs, that's better for me, isn't it? And especially in people who are aging with multimorbidity, that we might have, if you have fewer drugs, there's less drug interactions, less toxicities. So there's all these arguments. And the biggest move for 2-drug therapy is being with dolutegravir. And they've had 3 studies. One, a switch study with dolutegravir rilpivirine. The problem is, if you fail on that, you tend to get rilpivirine mutations, and you can get integrase mutations. So rilpivirine is a little bit of a weak link in that dual therapy. I'm going to show you some data from dolutegravir lamivudine, and lamivudine's got a very low genetic barrier, but we've not seen any resistant emergence in these. And those are patients who are naive to treatment, not switch. And finally, they've used dolutegravir 3TC in switch, and again, no resistance emergence. So it's really interesting that when you give dolutegravir in 3TC, we've so far not seen resistance emergence in the studies, although it can happen. But in the study with dolutegravir rilpivirine, we've seen some resistance. Now, here's the data on Gemini. So this is dual therapy versus triple therapy here, and you can see that the dots are almost on unity all the way along, with the confidence intervals crossing unity, very, very similar between 2-drug and 3-drug when you look at all these parameters, your age, your sex, your race, your RNA. But when you look at CD4, the low CD4 strata, this is a minus here, favored actually the 3-drug regimen. You did better on 3 drugs with a low CD4. So there is still a doubt over using 2 drugs in people with low CD4. And in fact, when you look at the number of people with a very high viral load, greater than 500,000, it's very few people in the studies. So 2-drug regimens seem fine, but if you've got a very high viral load, we don't have the data. And less than 200 copies, 200 CD4, it doesn't seem to do as well. Although the pure virological failures were very small, it was due to other reasons. So, resistance. I've said there's no resistance to dolutegravir 3TC in the studies. In the SWORD study using rilpivirine, there were people with resistance both to integrase and to non-nukes. And I'm going to show some data in the long-acting. Cabotegravir is similar to dolutegravir but injectable, and it's given with rilpivirine. And again, you can get resistance. So the 3TC seems to be a bit magical here, and we need to know why. But rilpivirine can be a difficult drug to take. You have to take it with food. You have to be careful about PPIs and other things that goes on. So that may be it. But what I would say is that all 2-drug regimens that work, the only ones that work are with reverse transcriptase inhibitors. The other advantage for you guys might be this cost. So this is the cost in Africa, not in India. For dolutegravir 3TC, it's a $14 saving over triple therapy. Now, multiply $14 by 20 million per year, it's a lot of money saved. So that's an issue. But I'm now going to show you why you really use this drug in India, this drug combination in India. And the major reason is a hepatitis B co-infection. You can't do this in Hep B because you'd be given 3TC monotherapy. And if you gave 3TC monotherapy to Hep B, within 4 years, almost everybody would have resistant hepatitis B. So, and in Zimbabwe, where I used to work, I worked there for a couple of years, 25% of people have Hep B. I've heard that in parts of northeast India, Hep B is very, very common. And you'd have to, so unless you've got a hepatitis B screening and vaccination program, this isn't a useful combo. You might need access to resistance testing because you don't know if you've got baseline resistance, whether this would work. TB treatment, is this going to be potent enough? You have to give the dolutegravir twice a day. Pregnancy, again, is it potent enough? We need to know. I've talked about the high viral load and low CD4. The rapid start, if you're going into that, I would advise against it because you don't know what their viral load is. You don't know what their resistance is. You're not going to probably cause harm in a couple of weeks while those results come back. But having to tell patients they're going to switch therapy from 2 to 3 drugs and we're going to change everything might not be a good strategy if you're going to do rapid start. We need more data on women, and they're running a big study on this, and adolescents. And if they can, I would make a cry out to the generic companies to either give bictegravir plus TAF as a dual therapy, or dolutegravir plus TDF or TAF as a dual therapy, because that dual therapy you could use in Africa. You could use in northeast India, because if you've got TAF or TDF, it will treat hepatitis B, and it's very rare to have a resistance issue. But we need Gilead to allow bictegravir to be used in that way. So another thing that you can do, which is very interesting, and I don't know whether this will actually catch on, is in people who have got an undetectable viral load and are suppressed, you only give them 4 days a week. Isn't that interesting? There was a study years ago called the PHOTO study where they let people have the weekend off, and with the efavirenz, and the efavirenz has a long half-life, so they could do that. But this is any antiretroviral, 4 days versus 7 days. It was run by the French with 300 people in each arm. And you can see here that actually it was non-inferior. But I always like to look at the data in a bit more detail. And when you look at the failures on the 4 days a week, you look at a low genetic barrier drug and a low genetic barrier drug. So I would only do this 4 day a week if people wanted to have weekends off, long weekends off, if they were on a drug like dolutegravir, bictegravir, or a boosted PI, because they're high genetic barrier drugs. It looks if they're on raltegravir or rilpivirine, it's a bit shaky. Okay, so toxicities. So all that glitters is not gold, and I want to now talk about toxicities that you need to be aware of. The first is safety in pregnancy, and the other is weight gain. The dolutegravir in pregnancy, about 1.5 years ago from Botswana, we had a signal to say there was an increased risk of neural tube defects if you took these drugs around the time of conception, and now we've had more data. It's still threefold the risk. And people believe that if you give folic acid, that risk will come down again by another half. And if you look at all the other drugs, you can see that's 0.3, 0.1, 0.04. If you give dolutegravir after the first trimester, there's no effect. And in HIV negatives, you can see the risk. So this has come down considerably, but it's not quite down there. But people believe if you give folic acid, that will happen. Why is folic acid important? Here's some data looking at zebrafish. Why zebrafish? Because they're a good marker of neural tube defects with drugs. So this is a zebrafish that's just given folic acid here. No effects on the zebrafish embryo. If you give it just dolutegravir on its own, you can see they become malformed, right? They don't look normal. If you give the folic acid and the dolutegravir, it's normal. So it looks like there may be some effect on of dolutegravir on the embryos, which can be reversed with folic acid. So this is experimental, but it's probably the best data we've got so far implicating dolutegravir and that. So I'm now just going to show you this. Weight gain and integrases. There's been cohort data, one group of cohorts saying there is a problem with weight gain and integrases, and another couple of cohorts saying not. We showed in our study, and this was in mainly white elderly men, that dolutegravir did increase weight gain, and in people these are people who switched drugs, people who stayed on the drug for 48 weeks, then switched, suddenly gained weight. So we saw a signal, and then, this was remarkable, if you go to Africa and look at the advanced study, these are women taking efavirenz, small weight gain. These are people taking dolutegravir with Truvada, a bigger weight gain, and these are people taking dolutegravir with TAF, a huge weight gain. And if you look in the red here, the dolutegravir TAF, these are the number of people over time becoming obese. So they've now got data, if you use dolutegravir, that you can increase weight, and if you use dolutegravir TAF, you might even get even greater weight gain. And bictegravir, the similar rise in weight gains on bictegravir and dolutegravir seen thus far. And then there's data from cohort study and now from Uganda suggesting that diabetes may be associated with the use of integrase inhibitors, independent of the weight gain. So now we have this whole issue over monitoring. So I would suggest you have a standard operating procedure to weigh your patients. Because in the winter, they'll be wearing their coats, right? And they get on the scales. In the summer, they're not. So have a way of measuring, weighing your patients and checking their glucoses and hemoglobin A1C on integrase. And finally, should we just forget pills? The next 10 years, I think we're going to go into long-acting drugs, because it prevents poor adherence. You can use them in pills, people who don't like pills, who are traveling and don't want to take pills, and they don't need to hide their drugs. And you can see over a 50-year period, this is the kilos of tablets you would take. If you move to long-acting drugs, these are the kilos you would take in 50 years of treatment. You actually take in a very small amount of drug if you go on long-acting compared with taking pills. And so what we've got now is cabotegravir and rilpivirine. There are two big studies in suppressed switch and in naive, which shows they are non-inferior to oral treatment. They're preferred by patients, but of course these are patients who go in studies, and there is some resistance. But there are some challenges. Again, you can't use Hep B. We don't know about pregnancy. You have to maintain a cold chain. There are IM injections. There's a whole lot of things here, just the same as any dual therapy, but also we have a problem with tail. So if you miss your injection, you can find cabotegravir up to 52 weeks post-injection, and rilpivirine 500, nearly 2 years, right? So if you have one injection and go away, those drugs can be in your body a long time, and you could get viral rebound and resistance. So the challenge is getting all the people back. We're now going to have stents, which might be a once-a-year drug. Imagine putting an implant in, an implant which has got drug in which lasts up to a year. They're already developing implants with tenofovir for PrEP, which is again in an implant, so things are really moving on. So, in conclusion, immediate start to ART. I'm not certain. I think it's a good idea, but we need more research. What to start? Is everyone going to be on integrase? It looks that way. 2 drugs, well, we've still got areas to resolve. And the role of new drugs like doravirine, we have to make sure that's well defined. Pregnancy and NTDs, for low and middle income countries, it's probably the risk is good, but for high income countries, we still have got to think about how we're going to use dolutegravir in women. Weight gain and diabetes, we need more data, so please collect it. And injectables looks like, to me, the way to go. And with that, I'd like to thank you for listening to my lecture.